Number 2, we're getting very close now to the worst of the worst. Whilst our last killer's folie à deux, her shared madness, saw the woman in the subordinate role of the relationship, our next killer turns this gender basis of our psychological convention on its head. This murderess had a male accomplice to do all of her bidding, which sadly involved killing 3 men and dumping their bodies in ditches. Like Rose West, she too had an interest in extreme S&M. I think it's safe to say that Britain has never known a woman as disturbed or so driven in her pursuit of death as the killer who makes it to number 2 on my list. She had multiple victims, intended to have more, and not content with just ending the lives of the men that she killed, she humiliated them even after their deaths. Who is this woman? Joanna Dennehy.
A mother who murdered 3 men and attempted to kill 2 others in Cambridgeshire has become only the 3rd woman in Britain to receive a whole life sentence. Joanna Dennehy had earlier pleaded guilty to the murders of Kevin Lee, Lucas Slabozewski and John Chapman during a 10-day killing spree in March of last year.
Joanna Dennehy came from a lower middle-class family, very loving father and mother.
But that all changed when she became a teenager.
She took to drink, smoking drugs, specifically skunk, and we all know that skunk can be extremely toxic.
Dennehy developed a taste for extreme S&M and realised she could exert power over men. One of the first men to come under her control was John Traynor.
She could see that John Traynor was somebody that she could wipe her feet on like a doormat. If she wanted to bring a woman home for sex in front of John Traynor, she'd do it.
Traynor would go on to become the father of her 2 children, children she would reject the moment they were born.
When the child's born, she doesn't touch it. She doesn't kiss it. She doesn't buy any clothes. She'll have nothing to do with this child, this little girl.
In this exclusive interview, Traynor discusses the horror of parenthood with Dennehy.
She'd slashed all her arm, blood was pouring, she had blood coming from there, and short mini skirt, she'd cut her legs, and both my kids are in bed, and she's pulled out this big, massive knife, and that was it. That was the end for me, that was it.
Joanna Dennehy's homicidal tendencies fully emerged after she spent a little bit of time in prison, and she was released. And she met a man called Gary Stretch.
Despite 7'3" Stretch dwarfing Joanne, he was completely under her control. But it wasn't until the pair met property magnate and landlord Kevin Lee that things really took a turn for the worse.
Kevin Lee ran a property business in Peterborough called Quitlet. And Joanna Dennehy went in there and asked him if he had any properties to rent because she was an ex-con. Kevin Lee had a roaming eye, and he took a fancy to Joanna. And so he moved her into one of his properties, and there she would live on the pretext that she would help to threaten tenants that had passed their sell-by date, and Lee wanted them out.
On the surface, it was an unlikely liaison. But by now, Dennehy was openly sharing amongst friends that she would like the thrill of killing someone.
Joanna Dennehy's first Peterborough murder was a Polish lad called Lucas. She met him in a big shopping mall in Peterborough. The following night, Joanna invited him to a property belonging to Kevin Lee, the landlord. She opened the door to him, and within seconds, she plunged a 5-inch lock knife into him 2 or 3 times. One stab went through the heart, and he died after a very, very short struggle in the front room.
As news reporters would later discover, that same house would be the scene of even more deaths at the hands of Dennehy.
2 of Joanna Dennehy's victims were murdered inside this house on the outskirts of Peterborough. The first, Lucas Slabozewski, a man she had befriended, was lured here with a series of text messages. He, like the other victims, was stabbed in the heart. His body was placed in a wheelie bin, Dennehy casually showing it to a teenage girl.
By now, Dennehy was high on drugs around the clock and believed she was invincible, able to get away with anything, including murder. And just a few days later, she struck again.
John Chapman was a tenant of Kevin Lee's. She hacked John Chapman to death while he slept in his bed.
By this time, Dennehy had embarked on an affair with Kevin Lee, who was becoming increasingly concerned by her erratic behaviour. She feared he may call the police if he learned of another death in one of his properties, so she hatched a plan to silence him.
She invites Kevin Lee to come round to the house where the Polish guy was murdered, and she says to him, I want you to dress up in a black sequined dress and we'll have sex. He went round to the house where Joanne was waiting for him. He slipped into something more comfortable, which is the black sequin dress. And after he'd put it on, she attacked him with a dagger. He was the only man to suffer any defensive wounds on his hands or his arms. He put up a desperate struggle for his life.
After the frenzied attack, Lee's body was dumped in a Peterborough ditch alongside her first victim.
He was found there a good few days later, wearing the black sequin dress. It was pulled up to expose his buttocks, and they'd inserted a metal bathroom object into his rectum to humiliate anybody that saw it.
Stretch made another trip to collect the rotting corpse of Chapman, who was also disposed of in this makeshift cemetery.
And then they decide the heat's going to be on, and they went on the run. For some reason, they decide to go west and go across to Herefordshire, where Gary Stretch has got some criminal associates.
By now, Dennehy had nothing to lose, and her determination to take human life was unstoppable.
Joanne Dennehy and Gary Stretch are driving around Hereford, and they come across a gentleman walking his dog near the city centre. And Dennehy says, stop, Gaz, I want to kill that man. And she stabs him 40 times. And she gets in the car with Gary Stretch and drives off. 10 minutes later, they attack another man walking his dog. The most ferocious attack you can imagine. A person who saw her said she was licking the blood off of the blade.
After the second frenzied attack, every police officer in Herefordshire was now looking for Dennehy. Within hours, they tracked her down.
When Joanne Dennehy was arrested, she put up no struggle at all. And in fact, when she went to the Central Police Station in Hereford, she came in and started flirting with the desk sergeant.
You're waiting to see tomorrow, right? It's all right. Yeah, I'm talking.
Shortly after, the police also caught up with Stretch, who gave himself up without a struggle.
After a short chase, Gary Stretch is arrested, and he puts his hands up, and he laughs, and he tells people, you've just arrested the most dangerous man in Britain. Joe and I are the next Bonnie and Clyde.
But even after her imprisonment, Dennehy is proving herself to be as deadly on the inside as she was on the outside, even terrorizing another infamous inmate.
When she first went into prison, her cellmate in the next room was Rose West. Within days, Rose West asked to be put into protective custody and shipped out because Joanne Dennehy was going to kill her.